straw claimed a full council tax on his second home.
No, it's Daily Telegraph.
It's all been laid bare in the last couple of weeks.
Flipping your address.
It was an extravagance too far for the Conservative MP.
Absolutely outrageous. Not a good morning for the government.
Mr. Hazel Blears is completely unacceptable.
James Pennell is accused in the Telegraph today of avoiding the payment of capital gains tax, according to the Telegraph.
They know they are next. Awful lot of claims for, you guessed it, £249. £14,000 for installing a wet room.
People are extremely angry
Across the political spectrum.
All MPs
Appear to be in it for themselves.
We're just normal people, and we pay every day out of our salaries to go to work, for our fuel, for our train. We pay for our lunch. We pay for everything out of our salaries, mortgages, everything. And now we're actually looking at a group of people that effectively we employ, and they're taking everything, and their wages just stay there. And the mood became, I would say, angry. We're paying for you, and you're taking it twice. The public deserved to know what was going on.
Good morning and welcome. More awful stories of MPs Expenses dodges today.
Would you like to have a look at the expenses of every single MP?
The expenses scandal just keeps on going.
An absolutely sensational story.
We knew instantly it was going to be almost like a demolition of Parliament.
This was the biggest political scandal since Profumo.
They're a disgrace.
We'd be crucified after we resigned.
They tried to send the police round to shut us down.
It was wrong and we must accept that, and we've got to do something pretty quickly to sort it out.
Gordon Brown has pledged to crack down on ministers found to be abusing the expenses system.
These are just a few of the MPs hanging on by their fingertips.
Tonight, some face very awkward questions.
One of the problems with the system that we have had is that it appears to have allowed things like that to happen.
My name is Chris Evans, and I'm the editor of The Telegraph. 10 years ago, back in 2009, I was head of news.
Robert Winnett, I'm the deputy editor here, and at the time I was the deputy political editor.
My name is William Lewis, and I was honoured to be the editor of the Daily Telegraph.
Christopher Hope, back in 2009, I was the Whitehall editor.
Matthew Bailey, at the time of MPs Expenses, I was the news editor.
I just started Telegraph, I was a reporter at the Telegraph. I'd been at the Sunday Times for 4 years before that. And I was about 3 or 4 weeks into being at the Telegraph.
It was only a year or so after the financial crisis. And I think, that has to be remembered as the context, because
we were in a recession. The economy was tanking.
It was just after the financial crisis had hit and people were beginning to digest the reality of what the collapse of Lehman's, Bear Stearns was going to mean for people around the world, but particularly in the UK.
Politically, we were in 2 years into Gordon Brown's premiership, and it wasn't going very well for him. The Tories were, under David Cameron, were mounting a pretty serious challenge to him in the polls.
There was a feeling of drift in the country, a lack of trust, certainly aimed at the financial system, of bankers not being punished for all of the chaos wrought.
Obviously, we were beginning to see the Gordon Brown premiership and the first wobbles. So it was into that kind of environment that the story began to hit.
The paper was under new ownership.
We were quite a new team. We had a young editor.
We had been through a really radical change program. We had tried to be the most forward-thinking, integrated newsroom there is out there.
We'd recruited some of the brightest and the best from across Fleet Street, and it was a good time to be involved in something like this. The untold story of MPs Expenses is that quite a lot of people turned it down before we did it. And I was the head of news, and I was reading the papers every day, and I could see that these bits of MPs Expenses were appearing in various places. And I was asking various people who worked for me, where do you think this is coming from, and why can't we have it?
We first got wind of the MP Expenses scandal really from the Freedom of Information Act, when some test requests went into Parliament to ask what were MPs claiming for.
But they should have given a huge amount of information quite quickly, because under FOI there's quite tight time limits to give the information, and the MPs House of Commons just wouldn't do that.
When the Freedom of Information Act was brought in 2005, one of the first things that everyone did at that time was to put in these requests to get details of MPs' expenses. So the Telegraph, the Sunday Times, independent campaigners like Heather Brooks had all been pushing very hard for several years to try and get this information.
I'm Heather Brooke. I did a lot of campaigning and reporting around the Freedom of Information Act, and I took the additional cost allowance case to the High Court for MPs' Expenses. I was trying to look at the whole system in a holistic way, and so I saw these little stories coming out, like they would go after one person, it was a scandal, and then it would be brushed aside. And I was like, you're just scratching the surface again. Like, the problem isn't like the bad apple, it's the whole pie, you know? It's rotten.
For several months, and indeed for several years, we knew that there was this great trove of expenses data out there. There was a few months where we suddenly started seeing quite a lot of information come out. There was stuff about Jackie Smith's husband.
The Home Secretary, Jackie Smith, was one of the first to face the scrutiny.
Media sources say she was not at home at the time. She lives with her husband, Richard Timney.
I am really sorry for any embarrassment I have caused Jackie.
And we were aware that there was probably someone out there who had this disc.
We knew that MPs' Expenses were going to be published because various people had been campaigning for their release and had fought various court battles. It later transpired that had the Telegraph not done its investigation, then most of the detail would never have emerged, because what the MPs were planning to do was to publish this stuff with all the salient details redacted, blacked out, so you couldn't really make sense of what was going on. And indeed, that's why this material was offered to us and to other papers, because the people involved in the redaction were so outraged that at what they could see was going on, but wouldn't be known because of the fact that it was being carefully excised.
A line manager gave us a basic outline that we were going to be dealing with a new process to do with MPs' expenses, and that process was the redaction of certain information that we would be told to remove. Initially, what happens is a lot of information is presented on the screen in front of you, and it's receipts or letters from the fees office, whatever. And initially, you're not actually reading the content because you're concentrating on learning the process. Once you've cracked the process, by day 2 in the morning, then you're starting to take in some of the information. And the first inkling you get is when you hear just a sigh of in disbelief. People are just frustrated. Not angry to start with, because you don't actually comprehend just what it is that you're looking at until the penny drops. People were starting then to correlate between their own lives and an MP and what they were actually claiming for. The mood became, I would say, angry by second week. Then anger became, you could cut it some days with a knife, and just exasperation. A couple of guys were back from Afghanistan and were told us they were only working to earn money, to buy equipment. It's a fact that they don't have enough equipment, or the equipment might be inferior. They sign up to do a job, they understand that. They know they're going to take losses. They're members of the armed forces. That's what they sign up to do. They've no problem with that. But when you see your own MPs who have sent you to war, effectively what they call coining it, over and above what they should be getting. It's not the expenses that got them, it's the claims and what they were for that got them.
Our most energetic and tenacious reporter at the time was Robert Winnett. So I said to Rob, will you please go and find out who it is who's hawking this stuff around and ask them if we can have it. I also had a conversation with the then editor, Will Lewis, and said, I really think we should be going after this. And he was as keen as mustard.
I wanted to find out more. I was like, well, you got to keep going, guys. I mean, you have a sense of obligation.
We were totally mystified, and I was talking to all the people that I would normally talk to in and around Downing Street on the one hand, but they were equally mystified, and there were all sorts of rumours going around about, was there a whistleblower out there? Was there someone inside the fees office who was leaking this stuff? So it was just a case of picking up the phone and just sort of putting feelers out and saying, look, if this is out there, we're interested in just spreading the word that we were sort of in the market for this stuff if it was available.
I'd known Robert Winnett. We'd worked at the Sunday Times together, and I'd known that he was chasing the disc. I mean, it was kind of at the time, it was very much everybody wanted the MPs Expenses disc. So I knew Rob was after it, and I knew he was sort of having communications with people that might lead to it. And I was on holiday between my two jobs, and every so often I'd ring into Rob being like, if you get it, tell me. I'll happily work for free, even though my job hasn't started.
Someone had phoned Rosa Prince in the lobby when she was working one Sunday with some information about this.
A guy at the other end said, hello, would you be interested in looking at a disc of every single MP's expenses? And I said, yes, I would.
And by pure coincidence, this was an American PR guy who I'd known 10, 15 years before, because he was a personal finance, public relations guy.
Rob, not so long afterwards, came back to me and said, I think I know who is hawking this stuff around. And I said, great, let's organise a meeting, let's get them in.
So I called him, and then I remember meeting him, I think in quite short order because of the calls that had been flying around, the next morning in a wine bar just off the Strand. He said he thought he knew someone who was involved in all this, who was a man called John Wick. And I think, again, within 24, 48 hours, I'd met John Wick, and I'd brought them both into the office to meet Chris Evans, who was then the head of news, and we began talking to them about how this might work.
John Wick. I run a risk management company based in UK. I got involved with the MPs Expenses because some people came to see me who had been working on the redaction of MPs Expenses, were concerned as to what was going on and wanted to get it out into the public eye. They had tried once and it hadn't been successful. They thought that I might be able to advise them how to do it. We had a company we used for public relations guidance, and I talked to the MD of that and asked how I talked to the media.
The person we were talking to was a guy called John Wick, who has a military background, and he came to explain to us how the person who was providing him with this information were people who were in the room dealing with the redaction of information which was going to be released under the Freedom of Information Act.
We actually could see what was going to be removed, and in essence the public would never see what we'd seen, and that's the real frustration, because the detail is all in the unredacted, not the redacted.
These people had sat there day after day, week after week, becoming increasingly angry.
We're just normal people, and we pay every day out of our salaries to go to work, for our fuel, for our train. We pay for our lunch. We pay for everything out of our salaries, mortgages, everything. And now we're actually looking at a group of people that effectively we employ, and they're taking everything, and their wages just stay there.
Ordinary people have got to pay for everything out of their salary and wages.
Yeah, I thought when you worked and got a wage, that's what you paid everything for. That's what I've always done.
What you're doing is wrong. It's abuse. And why are you doing it? What's the point? Because you can. What kind of answer is that? I mean...
And I think it was that sense of anger that was relayed to him and said, look, this is a real scandal. We're not insiders in Westminster. We're just normal people who pay our taxes, and you just will not believe what is going on here, and someone needs to be told about this.
And so one Monday morning, he and I sat down with two gentlemen, one called John and another called Henry, and Rob and I tried to persuade them to to let us see what they had. And they were in a slightly confused state because hitherto nobody had really expressed interest in what they had to say, what they had to offer. We were one of the first to have a website, The Telegraph. So I said to them, look, not only will we treat you fairly, we'll also treat the MPs fairly, and we'll publish all of it, every single MP's expenses.
There was a financial aspect to it as well. Chris Evans and myself had a discussion in which we said, look, well, The Telegraph don't pay for stories in this way. We're not a tabloid newspaper. It's not something we do, but this is sensational. These people need some insurance that, they could lose their careers.
I remember very clearly Rob and I leaving that meeting, which was in a room just over there, and walking across to see the editor in his office, which was just over there. And I said to him, we're going to need to offer them some money. And we thought, what's the most we could possibly offer them? And we thought, well, maybe we can persuade the editor to offer them £30,000. So we walked into Will's office, and he just said, £100,000.
Honestly, the payment thing is a red herring, right? I mean, this is one of the most important bits of journalism, if not the most important bits of journalism in the post-war period. I can't think of a more impactful bit of journalism for Britain and British society, highlighting such profound wrongdoing and systematic abuse at the highest levels of government and parliament.
The next thing I remember was Rob actually bringing the disc into the office, and it was a Friday afternoon. It was a sunny Friday afternoon, and I was waiting for him to come in, and he had this brown envelope, and it wasn't a disc at all. It was a strange red plastic box.
We opened it up, and we were just looking at it, and it sort of came up, all these different files and everything, and we went straight for Gordon Brown, and we opened it up, and up came his I think the first thing we saw was his itemised phone bill, and Rob just went, "We're going to jail."
And we looked at it, and lo and behold, it seemed to have a lot of MPs' expenses on it.
Because we had one hard drive, and the next morning we knew that several journalists would all be starting to work on it, we had to copy it across. And so we got another hard drive and started the copying process across, and then realised it would take about 40 minutes to copy it across, so we went to Wagamama's for lunch in the interim and left it in the middle of the Telegraph office while it was copying across, which in hindsight seems complete madness.
We had about 10 days before we started publishing. We were on this extraordinarily tight deadline.
We formed a team it's now known as the bunker, but it was an office at the back of the office. And we pulled together deliberately a range of people, from people who just joined, who were relatively inexperienced, to some of our most experienced journalists.
People who were tenacious and passionate, but with a range of experience, from the very young to the very seasoned, and people I thought would spark well off each other.
The team we put together, and I remember going around each of them individually at the time and telling them roughly what it was Gordon Rayner, who was our chief reporter at the time, Rosa Prince, who worked alongside me in the lobby, who was a really experienced political correspondent, Chris Hope, who even then had a reputation for digging into things, Holly Watt, who I'd worked with on investigative stuff, including expenses stories at the Sunday Times, Martin Beckford, who again had a reputation as a sort of forensic journalist who was very good at going through data and digging out figures and so on, John Swain, who was a rising star at the time and just come off our graduate trainee scheme, Caroline Gamble, who again was one of our more experienced news reporters, who was excellent at going out and talking to people on the doorstep, and Nick Allen, who again was one of our top news reporters, again relatively young.
I got a phone call to say, can you come in tomorrow at 7:30 for a training exercise? And I've been at the newspaper since 2003, so I was quite used to regular retraining and training.
And I explained to them what was going on, and I said there would have to be a cover story about some sort of digital training to explain why they were off their jobs for 2 weeks. And we locked them all in a room just around the corner, which no longer exists, and said, right, can you go ferreting for stories?
I think I just remember people arriving and being a bit kind of like, right, we're here, fine. And, people like, I think Chris Hope had to get up very early, so had Gordon. John Swain was there as well. And I don't think it was, they all just sort of grumbled their way in, and then the mood went from low-level grumble to total delight.
But then the work started.
Yes.
Everyone externally was told that we were working on a new training scheme, which was an emergency backup system, and we asked them not to talk about it or share any information beyond that room. Even when they went to the toilet, they were told not to talk about it.
So right from the beginning, we were drilled into us that this was secret, that we couldn't tell anyone. We didn't even tell our 2 other colleagues over in Westminster. It was just a total news blackout.
My girlfriend worked for the Daily Mail, so I was very conscious that I couldn't share the information that we had the disc. I think she thought that our relationship wasn't going to last very long. So when the first paper came out, that was somewhat of a relief to me.
I do remember there's some muttering about an IT programme and then no one was seen. And so for those first few days before going and joining the bunker, it was as though it was in this, no one knew where the bunker was. It was in this mysterious part of the building and none of the reporters in there were being seen because they were coming in before people were arriving and leaving after everyone else had left.
So my feeling in that room was one of extreme excitement, because as a journalist you want to try and kick the tyres, shake the system, and it's very rare that you ever get a chance to make real change with your journalism and a chance to really sort of hold that place, Parliament, to account.
There was a bubbling of excitement and people were obviously curious, but then in fairly short order they plugged in a disc for each of them, and they suddenly started looking at this stuff, and it was amazing how quickly everyone suddenly became totally obsessed with it.
The bunker itself,
it was rotten.
You walked in and it felt like it had really low ceilings.
The bunker was rotten.
It had no windows.
And it simply had a bunch of computers in it.
It was sort of fluorescent light, basically. You had this motley selection of journalists sitting in it.
Even when we started, it wasn't the most pleasant places, because one of the IT guys used it as a changing room for when he arrived in his cycling gear, so he stored all his Lycra in one of the filing cabinets.
And it started as a fairly pleasant work environment, but every evening we were eating takeaways in there. The cleaners weren't allowed in because we were paranoid that someone was going to go through the rubbish. So it quickly deteriorated into a fairly unpleasant student-like digs.
The reason that it wasn't cleaned was because there was a rumour that we had. It was quite a febrile atmosphere, and I can't remember where this rumour started, but we came to believe that the News of the World was trying to infiltrate the cleaning staff. And whether or not this rumour was true, it was decided that we shouldn't allow any cleaners in.
Hello, viewers. We brought down the government. Or Parliament. Little sweaty den, sushi around us, takeaway food.
The idea of expenses is quite simple for MPs. They need money to survive in 2 places. Firstly, in their constituency, they've got to be able to live there with their family and talk to around 80,000 people who live in the area and help them through all sorts of issues. And then, of course, during the week, for a few days, they must be in Parliament to vote on government bills, meet ministers, and fly the flag for their local constituency. So they're required to have 2 homes, but of course, most people only have 1 home. So what's fair? Well, what was seen to be fair, and is still the case now, is they're given help to live in London, where their second home should be. And that's where the expenses system came in. So they were given an allowance to spend on a second home.
When you open up this disc, you don't have a whole list of MPs and misdemeanours. You just have thousands and thousands and thousands of receipts. So you're taking a leap of faith that there is something in there. It's not obvious what there is.
And as you open each one, you'd be left with a number of options for each MP. You could look at their ACA, their living allowance, their IEP, which is an office expenses, and you just click on it, and within each file there'll be a year, and for each MP there'll be 5 years, and each file there'll be sort of 50 pages of all their claims.
We had to start looking through what were PDFs of documents. There was no way of electronically search through these things. It was just literally handwritten, most of it.
So you couldn't search for anything. You literally have to look at every single page and just click, click, click. You're really lifting the lid on the public persona of the MP and looking into their quite personal communications with the fees office.
People like Holly Watt were very, very good at detecting patterns and thinking things were too similar and so on and so forth. So they spent about 2 weeks locked in this room, going over stuff and preparing some stories for publication.
And we were trying to put it into some sort of order so we'd be able to compare claims and so on from one person to the next.
They could see patterns in things. If, for example, the amount someone was claiming for a mortgage hadn't changed for years and years and years and years and years and couldn't really be explained by a fixed rate, then you think, maybe this is not a real mortgage.
And we were starting to see things like the addresses where people lived and the fact people were claiming multiple addresses and moving between houses, which we just had no idea was even possible under the scheme until we saw it there in full Technicolor, as it were.
Had we not known what the address was that they put down on those forms, we would never have known that they were switching between one address and another to claim on more than one property. We wouldn't have known if two MPs who were married or living together were claiming for the same address. We wouldn't have known that they'd avoided capital gains tax when they sold properties because we couldn't have checked land registry records to see that they'd sold a property, how much it had sold for, how much profit they'd made. What Parliament proved when they published the expenses themselves was that they had intended all along to give the public pretty useless information, which would have meant they got off scot-free.
We had a meeting in the morning, which is when Tony Gallagher came in and essentially Chris presented him with the plan for the next day. And it was the cabinet.
We had a very orderly process about how we were going to go after different MPs. So we were going to start with the government and start with the cabinet. And within a few days, we were going to go to the shadow cabinet. And then we were going to do senior well-known MPs, the Liberal Democrats. And we devoted a day to Northern Ireland MPs. And then it was a matter really of just going after junior ministers, ex-ministers, and MPs who had colourful stories to tell.
We were trying to get eyeballs on every single document. There was around 2 million pages, so that was quite difficult to do in a few weeks.
So once we started looking at the expenses discs, we had Arthur Wynne Davies is involved in drawing up letters for each MP.
I said, it's got to go in a bespoke letter. It had to start saying, these are the allegations we put you, or these are the things we want explanations on.
Why did you behave like that? Or is this correct? Or why was this item claimed for? And then the MPs were given a time frame to respond by, usually the end of that day.
It was also my job to get the tone right. Don't be too aggressive. Be neutral. Give people a chance. Keep the presumption of innocence at the forefront of your mind. This is what we found out. What have you got to say?
From the start, we were concerned this could be a hoax. That is the big concern for any journalist. How true is the documents you're holding? Are they real or fake?
Yeah, look, I remain paranoid until the moment of publication. That Hitler Diaries moment lives long in everyone's memory.
But that was always the risk. We wouldn't know that until we started approaching the people who we were going to write about, and we couldn't do that until we knew who they were and we were ready to publish. Because once that started, it would start a chain of events that we couldn't stop.
Until you get someone saying, this is true, and we're sorry, but I'm going to say they're sorry, we're not doing it. I don't believe it.
The first person to respond was Jack Straw, who provided an explanation as to why he failed to pay his council tax on time. Only he could have known that, so at that point we knew that this information was genuine.
When Jack Straw's confirmation came through in his considered response, that's the first time I allowed myself to get excited.
Jack Straw came back at around 2:44, I think it was in the day, explaining why he'd done a claim for council tax and it was a clerical error and he'll sort it out. And once he said that single point about council tax, we knew we were in business because the document was true, we had a really, really big scoop, and the fireworks were going to come.
I was just over the moon because I thought he was the Justice Secretary. He was in charge of the legal machine. If anybody was going to go for an injunction and trigger it, it was him. And it wasn't. It was a hands up. Yes, I made a mistake. I've paid the council tax back. And I thought, I think I'm on record as saying, as soon as I heard that, we're in business.
In those days, it was much more common for newspapers with big scoops to spoof the first edition. So you would run a first edition that wasn't MPs Expenses, so no one would see it in time to change up, and you'd have the exclusive all to yourself in the second edition. And there was a sort of back and forth during the day about whether we were going to do that. But if we were going to do that, I had to get on with actually doing an ordinary paper. And I remember, ironically, it was a really scratchy news day. There wasn't much going on. And I was sort of scrabbling around looking for a story. And I remember Joanna Lumley had some big row about the Gurkhas with the government. And I sort of had to propose splashing on that, even though in my heart of hearts, I was sort of distracted by the fact we had this bombshell sitting in this bunker.
And then we decided we would pursue it, and we agreed with the vendors to go ahead and do it. And then there was a sort of strange hiatus where we all sat down and asked ourselves whether we should and shouldn't proceed.
There was a lot of tension the day before because we were putting the letters together, and then there was a lot of excitement when the letters started coming back in and people were responding, so we knew it was like a really, it was a big deal and it was true. And I think the main broadcaster had been invited in. So Nick Robinson was in the office, John Craig, and I think Tom Bradby. So I'd spent some time with them about 8 o'clock in the evening explaining what we were going to do.
I called the political editor of the BBC, the political editor of ITN, and also the political editor of Sky to say, we've got something, you're going to want to know about it. I knew one or two of these characters, so I did say, look, I wouldn't be calling unless it was important, and I really wouldn't be inviting you in unless we thought it was worth your time. I really think you don't want to miss this.
To get a phone call like that from a press officer of a big media group like The Telegraph was rare, if not unique.
My phone went. It was a mate at The Telegraph. You need to come in, he said. We've got something to show you. Believe me, came the reply. You've got to come in. And he said it in a way that I knew he meant it. I headed to The Telegraph's Victoria headquarters. I remember going up that long escalator, up to the newsroom, taken into a room. The door was shut, and then I was told the Telegraph had the disc. We're splashing the paper on it tonight. We can give you the information. You can't take it from here, but we think you'll think it's a big story.
And then I remember at 10 o'clock on the evening before publication, putting the main news channels on and every single one of them. That was the main first story. And you think at that point, right, we've got something here.
Good evening. Gordon Brown is among a group of 13 cabinet ministers whose expense claims are being revealed in detail by a national newspaper.
The embarrassment begins tonight for the government. It will follow, we're told, for other parties and for people at lower levels.
You claim 17,000 to do up servants' quarters in your mansion. That is undisputed, is it not?
Total disgrace.
I've done nothing criminal. That's the most awful thing. And do you know what it's about? Jealousy.
I just think it's very bad. Excessive.
Margaret Beckett, you've been fingered a bit by the Telegraph.
His authority seems to be draining away.
People are right to be angry, but she's still in her job. I mean, it looks like a shamble.
It's all of them in that parliament just now.
Order, it goes for the Prime Minister. He must be heard as well.
I think you should get the facts right.
Within a few days, it became obvious that the public were outraged by what they were reading, and all of a sudden we were no longer a small group of people within the Telegraph.
The sort of veil was drawn back, and people got to really see how taxpayers' money was being used.
Gordon Brown was probably on the phone to our then editor, shouting almost every day. And of course it was hard for him because he was Prime Minister, and suddenly the reality of what MPs had been claiming while everyone else was tightening their belts exploded.
I'm Andy Coulson, former Director of Communications.
Michael Duggar, I was the Chief Political Spokesman at number 10 Downing Street for the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown.
We had decided to go with the Cabinet, the Ministers, and then the opposition. Now, we were later accused of that was political bias and we were favouring the Tories. Well, actually, Labour were in government. We had to go for the government first. But it did give the Tories about 2 or 3 days to get their ducks in a row to a degree. But that said, they still got pretty lambasted.
The Telegraph set out with what I thought actually was a reasonably clear process on how you would approach these stories, that you would give us some time. There's an argument as to whether or not there's enough time, but some time to consider these allegations before you went to press.
We were given, enough time. There's sort of the usual amount of time a journalist would give you to respond to a story they're writing for the following day, but it was an incredibly detailed, complex story, and trying to piece all of that together. And you're dealing with, different cabinet ministers, their officers, they're in meetings, you're trying to pull them out, you're trying to do what you should always do, trying to establish the facts before deciding how to respond. But it really hit Downing Street like a tsunami, did that story.
What became clear, within days, is that they were taking apart the whole system. And I was like, wow, that's actually surprising. They're not going after one politician, they're not going after one party, they're looking at the whole system. MPs have been dreading the moment this summer when all their past expenses receipts were due to be published.
The MPs really thought it was okay.
So you're claiming expenses on a second home when you have 3 and you've got an income coming in from it.
Fabulous system, isn't it?
They were sort of so shocked and appalled to find out that people really didn't think it was okay. But so that was it. When they were ringing up, they still were like, well, this is outrageous. You just don't understand the system and and we're like, no, we do understand the system. And you have, to be fair, not broken the rules, but it's not looking great that you're getting your helipad hedge trimmed.
I remember Margaret Moran getting in a shouting match and gesture with Rosa Prince about how dare she ring her.
So she'd done up one house at public expense, at a great deal of public expense, and then she'd decided, oh no, that's not my main home. My main home is actually miles away. I phoned her up and she was incredibly indignant and defiant. So I remember her screaming at me in a very undignified manner. And I think in the end, she just hung up on me.
I remember Shahid Malik came out and was literally giving an interview on air, I seem to remember, attacking us for what we'd said, and he took a call from the cabinet secretary or someone in the government saying, you need to resign now, or we're suspending you because it appears like you breached the ministerial code. And they were sort of playing out in real time in front of us.
There was a group of MPs, from memory, people like Elliot Morley, David Chater, who had fraudulently claimed for mortgages. So part of what we were doing was checking people's mortgage claims against whether mortgages existed, which seems like a basic thing to do, which you'd have thought the parliamentary authorities did, but they didn't.
A number of MPs were not just over-claiming on their expenses, but actually claiming in a way that was criminal.
Even though we thought this would be big and it was exciting and it was huge, the level of misdoing and even criminality was on a scale that even at the start we couldn't have imagined.
Holly Watt was going through very, very carefully and slowly putting all of the addresses into a spreadsheet to work out what they were claiming, where they were living, and gradually we got these matches ping, and you'd find out that 2 MPs were living at the same address and both claiming expenses, and that's where it got into the area of alleged fraud, and that's where we thought, wow, this could really mean this could end political careers and possibly send some MPs to jail.
You could see that Elliot Morley had been claiming £800 a month for a mortgage that didn't exist, and it very quickly became clear that he claimed about £16,000 over a period of about 20 months. And at that point, we just knew that he was in very serious problems.
I think the arrest of MPs, MPs standing down, MPs being suspended, MPs being offered peerages. I mean, never mind those that went to jail. An awful lot of them had their careers ended either because they were forced to stand down or they were shoved into the Lords or they were given a knighthood. But it ended a lot of careers in addition to those that went to jail.
As I headed home from Downing Street, having done a live for the BBC's 10 o'clock news, my mobile phone went. I picked it up and I heard the raucous sound of jeering MPs. And one in particular was holding the phone and was saying to me, he was clearly drunk and he was clearly angry, you don't like our expenses, we're going to come for you. We're going to get your expenses published. See how you like it. Then he held the phone into the bar at the House of Commons. There was a roar of approval. It was at that moment I thought, this story is not just big, it's nasty.
The immediate reaction to what the Telegraph did was not, hurrah for the Telegraph, this is a work of journalistic genius. It was more, has this organisation committed contempt of Parliament? Shall we drag the editor to the bar of the House of Commons? And can we get the police involved? And shall we have a raid from Scotland Yard on the Telegraph's offices?
There were a number of MPs who wanted to pursue, some form of, or at least investigate, if you like, the possibilities of legal action against the paper, and particularly against the editor, Will Lewis.
Later, when we realised quite what we were dealing with, there was a lot of concern about being arrested, about the legality of it all, about the safety of it all.
Yeah, we were very worried about the threat of legal action, although we were confident that we had all the information, so there was nothing wrong, but we were worried that the police might become involved or that Parliament would do something.
I remember hearing a Labour MP on the radio suggesting that we should all be investigated and possibly arrested because the material was probably stolen.
I've got a strong memory of taking a phone call from a very senior figure at Scotland Yard who'd been urged to mount an investigation into what we had done, and then he rang a couple of days later to say he was suspending the investigation because it was clear no illegality had been committed.
My name is Paul Robert Stevenson. I used to be the Commissioner of the Met, retired in 2011. There was an approach by the House authorities to the Metropolitan Police Service that we should be looking at the circumstances as to how this leak took place and suggesting there might be some sort of criminal offence. I have to be honest, from the outset I thought that was rather fanciful. I guess the clearest cut element would have been if this had been a matter of national security. It clearly wasn't a matter of national security. It might have been a matter of national embarrassment and personal embarrassment for a lot of rather stupid and irresponsible people.
So that was another relief. Certainly I know it was a massive relief for Will Lewis and for us all.
Remember that first day when we were still worried that we might be prosecuted? A couple of the commentators came out and wrote really supportive comments about how this was important for press freedom. I remember Quentin Letts of the Daily Mail doing that and thinking that they were that this was big, that they were supporting us and that the whole of Fleet Street was coming together.
I remember a Simon Jenkins column in the Guardian saying the Telegraph had done the right thing, and more, so there was that feeling that the tide swung behind us.
It was just ludicrous. I have to say, the word ludicrous comes back again and again. These are public figures in receipt of public money, supposedly representing the public in Parliament, and they were sort of on the fiddle.
From my perspective, as a newspaper executive, one of the most gratifying things was the way in which the team gelled. I mean, I picked the team, and they were great. They got on really, really well, and you could see they were firing off each other. They had different skills and different personalities in this small, hot, very smelly room by the end of a week or two, and it worked very, very nicely.
Oh, we didn't really leave the office, I don't think. I mean, we'd go home, go sleep for, literally a few hours, and then come back in again, and, it just was absolutely relentless.
A member of the comment staff who didn't know what was happening put his head round the door and said, hi, anyone want to go for a drink? It was sort of at 7 or 8 at night. And there must have been 10 of us in there, and we all put our heads up and just stared at him. We couldn't even speak. We were all so absorbed and shocked and just swept up in what we were looking at that no one could even respond. So we kind of saw 10 pairs of eyes looking at him, and he just went, I guess not, and wandered off again.
We had this ongoing wall, the wall of death or something, I don't know.
Wall of glory.
The wall of glory. And so we got to the point quite early on of printing out photographs of the MPs and sticking them up and crossing them out one by one.
Pictures of MPs who had to pay back money or apologised or said they were standing out next election.
By the end of it, it was full of different MPs who'd done different things, and I think there came a time where the room had to be dismantled because we were changing the office plan, and somebody took it all down and put it in a box carefully for posterity and left it somewhere safe, and then the cleaners threw it all away. But there you are. These things happen.
I do remember Will Lewis, at one point I was like, I think for some reason I was like, what's the weather like outside? And he was like, it's raining. And we just had no way of knowing whether it was rain or not, and it wasn't raining, but he didn't want us leaving the office, so that was that.
It was intense. I was half firefighting, half making sure that stories needed to have statements or be reacted to. We also had a number of people that wanted to talk about the story, although they weren't actually involved with it. So in many ways, it was also like herding cats.
One of the funny things about MPs Expenses was that it really did benefit sales enormously at a time when newspaper sales were declining. And we noticed, I seem to recall, that there was one particular area, I think it was in South Wales, where newspaper sales were going up and up and up, and we couldn't really account for it. And then somebody said, eventually they worked out that it seemed to be where there was an HMRC office where they looked at MPs' tax returns, and it seemed that everybody there was buying extra copies in order to find out what they could glean on MPs. Whether that's true or apocryphal, I don't know, but that's what I was told.
No, I think she should definitely go.
I think it's a disgrace.
I think it's outrageous how the MPs are getting to spend our tax money on their frivolous lifestyles.
The first rule if you're a politician dealing with a rolling story, where there are new revelations every day, where you're not in control of the flow of data, when you've already lost public opinion, is to get ahead of it, not to be constantly racing to catch up. Brown was always racing to catch up, always angry, always resentful. David Cameron tried to leapfrog him, setting up his own sort of internal inquiry system.
It was from the get-go we were clear that this was full square in the realm of public interest. Whatever the technicalities of it, this was clearly an investigation, a piece of work that was in the public interest.
I am angry about what has happened. It is out of order. Some of this is an abuse of taxpayers' money, and I'm going to deal with it.
And you talked to yourself about the Daily Mail test. Does this fall short of that?
David Cameron had the advantage of not being in government, so by definition your pitch to the country is about change. I certainly think after the MPs Expenses scandal, the appetite for change was a greater one. I think it was harder for Labour in government because we'd been in power, it had happened on our watch. It didn't really figure so much in the election, I don't think, in terms of people's desire to vote Labour or Conservative, but it definitely impacted on people's desire not to vote for anyone.
In one sense, it was a sort of fascinating exercising how different people kind of react when under pressure and when faced with accusations that are of quite personal nature, actually.
And I remember one particular question time, I think it probably must have been in the middle of the first week. Margaret Beckett was on as representing the government, and the audience started booing her, really going at her.
Mrs. Beckett, are you going to pay back the £72,000 that you've taken?
No, I'm not, because, as I pointed out a moment ago, they do. And there are two reasons for that. One of them is because...
And I realised at that point that the tide of public opinion was not just outrage, but it was anger, really, really angry.
The rules, the system for MPs was written because they're honourable members. They were, and you just read out there, was quite explicit. It has to be wholly necessary to do their job as an MP. What could be more plainer than that? They don't need scatter cushions, bottles of gin, plugs. It's not the system that's wrong, it's the people, the MPs themselves.
I like the fun ones. I like the ones that I forget who it was claiming for her, it'll come back to me her name, but claiming for dog food and Scotch eggs, and the guy who claimed from a Pepperami from a minibar, Mark Francois. And I absolutely insisted, just because I'd loved the advert from when I was a kid, on having the headline described him as a bit of an animal, just because I liked the Pepperami advert. And we did have moments of light relief. I remember Phil Woolas arguing with Martin Beckford about the facts he'd claimed for his wife's tampons because the money got paid back.
Going through all this information, you got to sort of buy into the idea of, say, ginger crinkles, and that was one of the things which one of the MPs claimed for. So I went out and bought 10 packets from Sainsbury's and gave them out in the office, and so we survived on a diet of ginger crinkles for at least a day or two.
I had a great letter from Austin Mitchell, the Labour MP, who was the only MP who decided to react with humour, and he wrote a long letter explaining that he was very sorry for claiming for ginger crinkle biscuits, and he was also extremely sorry for claiming for some gin and some vodka, and he said that he didn't drink. and that therefore the alcohol must have been claimed by his wife, and that he would immediately assess whether she was an alcoholic and put her in rehab if necessary.
Richard Younger Ross, who was down in Devon, he claimed for a bookcase called the Don Juan, which...
I love the fact that Chris Humes had paid for pictures of himself, and was Chris Humes the one with the trouser press? Someone claimed for a trouser press, and it was so Alan Partridge.
I remember Natasha Engel, who is now quite a senior MP. She chairs the backbench committee. I remember her phoning me up. She was so, she couldn't bear the anticipation. She couldn't even wait for it to be her turn. She phoned me up ahead of time and said, I bought all these glasses from John Lewis. I know I shouldn't have, and I feel really bad, and can you please do the story now? They were in such a state, these MPs, waiting for these calls.
There were really clear patterns that came over from the absolute beginning, which was stuff like, it was done on a financial year, so at the end of, when they got to March, they'd suddenly realised they hadn't spent all the money they'd wanted to do, so they would just bolt to John Lewis and literally just go mad.
I remember Tom Watson, who's now deputy leader, they'd gone to John Lewis and had fun at the public expense, and at the time, he's lost a lot of weight since, but Tom Watson was very overweight. He must have obviously checked his own expenses, and he spotted the thing that I spotted, which was that he'd charged for a pizza cutter. So I remember him phoning me and saying, please don't put the pizza cutter in, please, we're old mates, don't put the pizza cutter in. And I had to say, I'm sorry, the pizza cutter's going in.
I think it was Nick Allen he sort of at one point was like, gather round people. And this was a few weeks in, I can't remember how long we'd been there. And we were quite cynical at that point, we were quite jaded, and we were like, right, dragged ourselves over. And Nick was like, look. And we were like, what is that? And he was like, that is a duck house.
I just sort of involuntarily said, what the hell is a floating duck island for £1,645. As I remember it, Matthew Bailey was sort of sitting in my eye line, and he responded in slightly fruitier language, what is a floating duck island?
And I remember the duck house as well, and I definitely uttered a word that rhymes with it. But they were proper kind of, I'm doing it now. You sort of exhaled and shook your head and just thought, I don't know how that happened.
People started to sort of come over and look at this.
And then he clicked on his screen and you could see it on Google Maps. He zoomed right into the middle of this lake, and there was this little square, and there was the duck house.
You can see it from space.
That was a good day.
And that's how you end up with, MPs on TV and radio, talking about how proud they are that their house, is compared to Balmoral.
Do you know what it's about? Jealousy. I've got a very, very large house. Some people say it looks like Balmoral. It's not particularly attractive. It just does me nicely.
Not a great moment.
There'd be Labour MPs who'd want to talk about their expenses and talk about perhaps what the Telegraph had got, and they would come in and they'd be very sheepish, they'd be very quiet. A lot would be very upset and in tears. And I would sort of say, trying to cut to the chase, look, what are we talking about here? Is this overly complex mortgage arrangements, or is it consumer goods?
I remember it was Rosa being like, somebody's claimed to clean their moat. And it was just like this, Rosa in full outrage. And she was just really cross. And she was just like, how could somebody claim to clean their moat, for God's sake,
I was genuinely taken aback and shocked at that. Yeah, I was the moat. So this was Douglas Hodd. It was Rob who rang Andy Coulson, because it was very early on, and saying, yeah, it is bad, and saying, there's a moat.
Now, Mr. Hogg always said that he never specifically claimed for the moat, that it was part of a deal with the Fees Office to allow him to claim the full allowance to maintain his estate. But to the public, it stank.
But as to the claims that I made, they were agreed in advance and in writing, and fall within both the spirit and the letter of the rules.
Those moments, the moat, the duck house, they weren't subtle. They were crystal clear, damaging moments for the Conservative Party, and we all knew it.
Some veteran politicians are horrified at the wounds inflicted.
Mention expenses, and the fury was switched on like that. It was the symbol, if you like, of one rule for them and one rule for everybody else. Now, it would have been a powerful story at any other time, but this wasn't any other time. It was coming in the wake of the crash of the banks, and more importantly, coming in the wake of the bailout of the banks, a time when it appeared that men, largely, who wear suits, yes, who live and work in Westminster, were all right, but ordinary people were suffering. And so the news that you could claim for your dog food, for your duck house, enraged a country that was already pretty enraged.
It really touched a nerve with people, the sense that there was this organised racket against the people that had been going on for many years, and by our own diligence and good fortune, we'd been able to lift up that stone and shine a light and where one had never been shone before.
What will have angered the public was that MPs were claiming for exactly the sort of things that they have to go out and buy out of their own pocket.
The stuff that sticks in my mind is really the flipping of houses. I mean, these people who were building up property empires by moving from one house to the next, claiming the mortgage interest, paying for the renovations of these properties. Yeah, I mean, sure, the small claims were funny and they added to the public shock about the whole thing, but I just did not realise till I saw that some of these people were getting rich.
Well, I was astonished, even as someone who'd been heavily involved in this and had been aware of some of the abuses. I was astonished at the venal nature of some of these claims. The most egregious ones were the house flipping claims, which never got held to account, and they should have done. Some of those were astonishing. And the MPs, some of those MPs got re-elected, and they shouldn't have done. MPs who behave now, we shouldn't have got re-elected.
This was, just not on at its lowest level and an outrage at its highest. There were the argument in defence of it, and several people tried to make it, as you know, often against our advice. The sort of reaction to it was laughter.
Matt did a fantastic cartoon. It was not necessarily unfair, which simply had two MPs walking across the bridge outside the House of Parliament, and she said,
"As soon as I saw what I'd been up to, I knew the Speaker had to go."
The Speaker at that time, Michael Martin, made a catastrophic and historic error. He saw himself as a kind of shop steward, a trade union representative for MPs. He saw his job, therefore, as defending them and their reputation, and the reputation of the House of Commons, against what the public were reading in the Daily Telegraph and hearing on their TV screens. So instead of becoming the agent of change, the man who said, we have to improve things, there's a man who said, we made mistakes, we can reform the system, he was the guy making excuses, which is why in the end, he was kicked out. The first for hundreds of years, the biggest scalp the expenses crisis got.
Order. Well, I've made it perfectly plain. I think the Speaker's run out of road and he ought to go, frankly, and everybody's interest, including his own. We have an unprecedented situation where the Speaker has, I'm afraid, been one of the blockages to reform of MPs' expenses, where he's blocked release of freedom of information, and where I'm afraid he's thought it's in Parliament's interest to sweep everything under the carpet rather than to move into a new regime.
Some people lost their jobs. Some people deserved to lose their jobs, by the way, so there was a bit of natural justice in some instances. I think I was sad for colleagues who I felt who had got really mixed up in a bad system and through no fault of their own. The rules were how they were at the time, the culture was what it was at the time. They had come into this. I don't think they'd acted in a way that was dishonourable or that they were out necessarily to enrich themselves. I think there were individuals who were, but there were far more who weren't. I still think the vast majority of people who come into politics do so for public service.
I felt particularly bad when I had to ring Kitty Usher, who was a junior Treasury Minister, who'd accidentally or inadvertently included in a file a note to her accountant about reducing the capital gains tax on one of her houses, and she had to resign because of that. And she had, like me, she had a very young child, and when I rang her, she was at her home, and I could obviously hear that she had a screaming baby in the background. And because I had a screaming baby at my house, I did feel a bit bad, because I knew it was going to be the front page the next day, and I knew it was going to be the end of her ministerial career.
I remember the night after Elliot Morley, I was emailing my sister and I said I was feeling incredibly sad about what happened to Elliot Morley, and it was, you know, that his life was ruined and that was going to be devastating for him and his family and everybody else. And she was like, well, you might have created a situation where you get better politicians in the future. And the thing is, I mean, I'm not sure if that's what happened. I think there was this enormous sort of rage from the general public that was justified, but I think it just created a really profound cynicism.
A lot of MPs, I think, went through a difficult time as a result of the stories that we did, and we were very mindful of that. I think one or two in particular found it very challenging. During the process, I did make sure that I contacted the leaders of the three main political parties. Obviously, every MP was given fair notice of the stories, and they were given a chance to comment on it and to tell us that it was inaccurate, and they got a fair share of commentary in each story. But I was concerned that there were one or two who were finding it particularly challenging, and as a result of that, went the extra mile, in my mind, to ensure that they could be protected.
We've had the biggest parliamentary scandal that we've seen for 200 years. And I want to apologise to you on behalf of the Labour Party for the behaviour of some of our members of Parliament.
The effect of this scandal on Gordon Brown's government, I think, was terminal. David Cameron, who was the coming man, he was the leader of the opposition, he certainly took a stand saying, this is wrong, I will sort it out. But Gordon Brown was slower at that. I think it's that sort of summarised that he was so almost clinging on to power by then, it became quite apparent through the following 12 months that he would have a real problem in winning the 2010 election.
Looking back now, it's easy to forget quite how dangerous these times were for Gordon Brown. Large parts of his cabinet were unhappy with his leadership. Large parts of the Labour backbenches were unhappy. There was constant talk of replacing him. Combine the economic crisis, combine his lack of personal political skills and charisma with the expenses crisis, and you had a very dangerous mix indeed. These were dangerous times.
The legacy of the MPs Expenses scandal is that the system is cleaner, that the rules are tighter, that they're properly scrutinised by an independent body, and some of the matters for which claims could be submitted previously have now been outlawed. So that's a good legacy.
In terms of politics, the lasting impact, I think, was really important. People got to see where their money was going. They got to see the abuses in the system. They got to see the way the system should be reformed.
Well, I don't know whether it would have ever come to light otherwise. I suspect not. I suspect that some of the behaviour was known to some people already, but it hadn't come to light until the leak to the Telegraph and until that release. And I do think, and I don't want to pander to the Telegraph here, but I think there was a great public service done to ensure that we did something to clean up our parliamentary system and the standards that were being applied there.
I think it did lead to a whole new cadre of MPs coming in. The 2010 intake in the House of Commons was one of the biggest ever. I think a third of the MPs were elected for the first time.
I think the public has always been hugely cynical about politicians and sceptical of what their motives are and what they get up to. I think that is not going to go away anytime soon, but ultimately in a democracy that's entirely healthy. And if you don't have tight scrutiny of MPs, you have a corrupt regime, as we see in lots of other countries.
Fundamentally, it damaged politics. I think it damaged the political system. I think it damaged Parliament.
It created a real anger towards politicians, which I think is still there, a deep suspicion, a deep cynicism. And we're journalists. We weren't trying to create, an alternative. We were just knocking down what had been. It has had consequences. I'm not sure if it's all from the Telegraph, of course not, but it was something that people identified with in a really furious way.
I think the relationship between the public and the sort of political class, if you can put it that way, was already strained pre-Expenses, but I think Expenses was a major point of sort of dislocation that I'm not sure, I don't think we've ever recovered from. It's only got worse. I think you can draw a straight line from the Expenses scandal to Brexit. I'm not saying that's the reason why it happened. I'm not even saying that there are people who walked into the into the voting booth with, a duck house or a moat in mind, but I think it was there actually, buried deep, that sense that you can't trust them, that sense that that they're, in the end they won't do what they say they'll do. I think that was part of the process and unfortunately part of the reason why that we've got such a gap now between the public and our politicians, which I think in long term can only be bad for us.
It was a time when politics was not in any great regard. We've been through the great crash. Everybody was looking at professional people and wondering whether they're quite up to scratch. And here the people who are ruling the country not up to scratch. So it was quite a sensitive moment. And I think Parliament is obviously in the frame. This scandal breaks. It is inherently ludicrous rather than scandalous in my view. And it was the ludicrousness that made it a great story.
I think there was a sense that it had far more impact than we anticipated, in that it led to a new speaker. You could argue it contributed to the downfall of the Labour government. It certainly contributed to the contempt in which MPs were held at the time, and for many years thereafter, actually. I think there's been a sense that, and I would say incorrectly, that MPs are all in it for themselves and they've all got their snouts in the trough, and I don't think we ever intended it to be like that.
I have one or two nagging doubts about the fallout. I watched who was arrested and who went to prison, and I thought it was just a bit too easy, because they were dispensable people. They were, to some extent, the less valued MPs, and I wonder to this day whether there were others who might have been arrested and sent to prison instead. Because it seems to me that just enough happened to satisfy public disquiet. But those who bore the brunt were not big players at the time.
The sad thing about this saga is it has reinforced the idea that was out there. The idea, frankly, I hear every time I get into the back of a cab in London. They're all the same, Nick, they say to me. They're all on the take. They're all in it for themselves. It wasn't true, and it isn't true. But the expenses crisis risks making it look like it was true. Did the expenses crisis create Brexit? Of course it didn't. But combined with other things, it may well have created the circumstances in which people no longer trusted what they were told by politicians.
On the whole, I think most MPs take the attitude that it was painful and unpleasant, but it needed to happen, and we're not going to blame the messenger. But it took a while for that generally to become the consensus, and there are certainly a few who hold a grudge.
I still think there is a tendency in Parliament towards secrecy and a lack of transparency, and we see that in the Standards Committee now, that effectively it's MPs judging themselves.
It's still pretty hard to get information out of the British state. I'm not totally up to speed on the latest with MPs Expenses, but the thing I was trying to do with this whole campaign that lasted 5 years was to enable a member of the public to just go online or go into Parliament and look up their MPs' receipts, all the receipts of what they were claiming on the taxpayer. You still can't do that.
I think the MPs Expenses disc was a signal moment in British politics in terms of transparency and the importance of freedom of information. The details that MPs publish today are a little bit more limited, and what we get is not quite as juicy as it was in the past. But being able to go back to the old days of hiding all this information and just assuming it's a bung on top of your salary are long since gone, and in that sense freedom of information has been very important.
I don't know that any lessons have been learned from MPs' expenses. Only today there are stories about how much MPs pay themselves, and we're not really clear about what our MPs are worth. You can find some people who say they should earn no more than a nurse or a teacher, and other people who say that they should be on the same salary as a FTSE chief executive. I mean, you hear that quite a lot from MPs, funnily enough.
On the other hand, it did show how transparency, how decent journalism, how courage by a news organisation can force an organisation to change when it thinks it's above the rules and above the law.
I hope that the legacy of the expenses scandal is that there's a more transparency in public life. We get to find more things out about the way in which our money in particular is spent. But I also hope that it leads to a long-term change in the value of investigative journalism, and that people realise the value in getting involved in these projects, you know, the value it brings to the public, the value it brings to organisations, and that that's something that lasts for many decades to come.
Still, people say, you know, what a great story, what a great story. How fantastic to be part of that. So
it did feel like there was a kind of a revolution of the pen.
It was such a big story at the time. You could argue that this was the biggest political scandal since Profumo in the early 60s. That was sex, this was money.
I mean, it seems extraordinary to me that it's been 10 years because I can remember it so clearly. And it's one of those things that you know, if people ask what you do and what you've done in your career, you mention that and everyone knows what you're talking about. And there's a real sense of, you know, achievement in having been a part of that team and playing some part in telling that story.
do you remember that picture, that photograph taken towards the end? I don't know if you've got that picture, just try and dig it out. And there's Rob sitting in the middle and everyone looking absolutely ashen-faced, the purple-eyed, drooping, Rob slightly head on one side. Everyone was just absolutely exhausted, clearly, because it was 5 to 6 weeks of going for it.
I just went off on my own to Victoria Station and sat in McDonald's and ate a big quarter pounder with cheese on my own, and I don't think I thought a thought. I just stared off into space and munched it, and it was the greatest cheeseburger or item of food I think I've ever had.
I can't remember exactly how many weeks afterwards, but Chris Hope coming in saying, the bunker's been taken down, the bunker's been broken up.
Oh, yeah.
We went to have a look and it had all the panels had come down and it was all just an open office. So it wasn't there anymore. It's quite sad.
It was such a privilege to work with that team. We knew we were making history and I was very proud to have helped.
I am naturally a huge believer in the importance of investigative journalism, and I am obviously well placed to know how hard it is to bring stories to life, to put things like this in the public domain. It wasn't easy. It took a lot of hard work by a lot of the reporters who worked for me, and it took a lot of courage on the part of the editor. And of course, since we did MPs Expenses, we've had the Leveson inquiry and various other attempts to limit free speech. And I think we should always bear in mind the importance of things like MPs Expenses. And every time someone tables a motion to limit the powers of the press to say this or say that, we should look back to MPs Expenses and ask ourselves, would we be able to do that now if this or that were the law of the land?